The silent approach of Hulagu Khan's armies was the sound of the world ending. For 50 years, the Mongol Empire was not a political power, it was a cosmic event, a biblical plague that consumed nations. In 1260, there was only one power left, a kingdom ruled by former slaves. They couldn't win with numbers, they couldn't win with prayer. They could only win with a single, brilliant lie, a secret weapon of tactical deception that would destroy the greatest army the world had ever known. This is the Battle of Ain Jalut. In the long, opulent history of the Caliphate, Baghdad had stood for half a millennium as the irreplaceable center of global culture, scholarship, and commerce. It was the house of wisdom, 1001 nights made real, the living memory of a great civilization. All of that ended in a single, cataclysmic winter, when Hulagu Khan, the grandson of Genghis, laid siege to the city. The armies facing him were soft, their walls were antiquated, and their minds were broken by years of terrifying legend. Hulagu brought 150,000 men and the cold, terrifying knowledge that nothing they encountered could resist them. The siege lasted just 12 days. When the gates were opened, the massacre began. The Mongols did not distinguish between soldier and scholar, woman or child. The great libraries, repositories of knowledge saved from the ancient world, were thrown into the Tigris River, their ink turning the water black for days. The Caliph himself was executed, and the city's population, possibly numbering in the hundreds of thousands, was systematically slaughtered. Baghdad, the center of the world, became a mound of smoking ruins. The sack of Baghdad was not just a military victory, it was a psychological weapon aimed at every ruler still standing. The message was clear: there is no God who can save you, and there are no walls strong enough to hold us out. A shockwave of terror shot across the known world. The conquest of the Levant, Syria, Palestine, and the coastline came next, and it was barely a contest. Hulagu's armies, now consolidating their power as the Ilkhanate, pushed south, their objective crystal clear: the rich, fertile lands and vital ports of Egypt. Every kingdom from Europe to India was paralyzed. Kings and nobles huddled behind their castles, hoping to be overlooked. No one was willing to risk total annihilation by facing the Mongol cavalry on the open field. Their armies were too fast, too numerous, and their tactics the unending arrow storm, the brutal feigned retreat, the supreme discipline were alien and utterly devastating. The consensus was that the Mongol hordes were the scourge of God, a force of nature that had to be endured, not fought. It was in this moment of collective despair that the last domino stood alone, the final bastion refusing to fall into line. This was the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. The irony of history is profound. The only power with the audacity to stand against the empire of the Khans was a state founded and ruled by former slaves. The Mamluk Sultanate was a warrior kingdom built on the Ghulam system, a training process where captured boys, often of Kipchak, Turkic or Circassian origin, were brought up from childhood to be soldiers. They were rigorously trained, educated, and instilled with a discipline that bordered on religious zeal. Once free, these men, the Mamluks, meaning owned men or slaves, formed an elite, self-perpetuating caste of professional soldiers. They were not knights. They were an efficient, unyielding military machine that held absolute power over Egypt. They were the ultimate meritocracy of the sword, and they were the only force left with the will to fight. Their iron discipline was the one thing the Mongols could not conquer. The two worlds were about to collide. On one side, the Mongols, fueled by boundless conquest and the terror they inspired. On the other, the Mamluks, powered by a discipline forged in bondage and a desperate will to survive. But before the armies could clash, the Mongols sent their final, devastating message. In the early summer of 1260, 4 Mongol envoys rode into Cairo carrying a letter from Hulagu Khan. The letter was less an invitation to surrender and more a funeral dirge. It listed all the nations Hulagu had crushed and demanded the Mamluks submit unconditionally or face the same fate as Baghdad. The arrogance was total, the threat was absolute. The city held its breath, awaiting a decision that would determine if Egypt would continue to exist. The Mamluk leadership gathered to debate the impossible. Some urged caution. suggesting a retreat to the protection of the Nile Delta. But the Sultan, Saif ad-Din Qutuz, was a man who understood that history did not reward the timid. He had lived through slavery and the brutal politics of the Mamluk court. He knew that to retreat was merely to postpone annihilation. To the horror of the world, Qutuz did not just refuse the surrender. He performed a chilling public act of defiance that committed his people to war. He ordered the 4 Mongol envoys to be executed. Their heads were impaled on the Bab Zuwayla gate of Cairo. This was not just bravado, it was a definitive line drawn in the sand. It signaled to the Mongols and to the Mamluk people that there would be no negotiation, no retreat, only total war. If you want to see more stories of defiance and impossible victory, please subscribe to the channel. The decision to fight set the stage for one of history's most dramatic pairings, Sultan Qutuz and his general, Rukn ad-Din Baybars. Qutuz was the steady, immovable rock. He was the pragmatic leader who could inspire loyalty and make the ruthless choices required for survival. Baybars, however, was the fire, a brilliant, aggressive tactician whose mind worked at a furious speed, a man who had fought the Crusaders and had a deep, intuitive understanding of the nomadic mindset. Baybars knew that the Mamluk heavy cavalry, the Furicea, was arguably the finest fighting force in the world, with a discipline that surpassed even that of the Mongols. But he also knew that their numbers were critically low compared to the Mongol reserve. They could not win a war of attrition, and they could not afford a single mistake. They needed to force a decisive, single-day battle on their own terms. The Mamluk response to the threat was revolutionary. Instead of preparing a siege defense, Qutuz and Baybars led their army out of Egypt and marched straight into the Levant. Their objective was simple: face the enemy before they could consolidate their forces and before Hulagu himself could return with reinforcements. This decision was a profound act of military heresy. Every other power on earth had learned that to meet the Mongol army in the open field was suicide. Qutuz and Baybars did it anyway, guided by the cold, surgical mind of Baybars. The Mongol forces facing them were led by General Kitbuka Noyan, one of Hulagu's most seasoned and trusted generals. Kitbuka, an experienced campaigner, was confident to the point of arrogance. In his eyes, the Mamluks were merely the last of a long line of rich, soft city dwellers waiting to be swept away. He believed that no one would dare engage his army. This deep-seated Mongol hubris, their complete belief in their own invincibility, was the fatal flaw that Baybars intended to exploit. Baybars and Qutuz began moving their forces through Palestine, taking advantage of a brief, unexpected window of opportunity. Hulagu Khan had recently withdrawn the majority of his army and returned to Mongolia following the death of the great Khan Munka, leaving Kitbuka with a formidable but reduced force estimated between 10,000 and 20,000 men to garrison the occupied territory. The Mamluks fielded a force of roughly the same size, composed of their elite cavalry and local Syrian auxiliaries. The odds were still terrifyingly even, but for the first time in 50 years, they were not catastrophically one-sided. The Mamluks continued their aggressive northward march, bypassing the Crusader strongholds and using the promise of liberation to secure supplies and intelligence from the local populace. The stage was being set for a confrontation unlike any the world had seen. As they marched, the Mamluk commanders finalized the details of their unorthodox plan. It relied entirely on the perfect execution of a single, highly specialized tactic, the feigned retreat. It was a move the Mongols themselves often used with devastating effect, luring the enemy into a disorganized chase before turning to slaughter them. Baybars planned to use the Mongols' own tactic against them, only with far more precision and purpose. The Mamluk army was trained to run without breaking rank, to chase without losing formation, and most crucially to turn and fight as a single disciplined hammer blow on command. This iron discipline, born of the Gulam system, was the true foundation of the Mamluks' strength. It was the only force in the world that could execute this dangerous dance of deception without collapsing into a rout. The entire campaign now rested on one man's ability to run without panicking. The success of the entire campaign now rested on Baybars' ability to lure the Mongols to the location he had personally selected for the final confrontation. The location was a perfect, deadly bowl of land nestled in the Galilee. The Mamluks arrived first at the chosen site, Ain Jalut Goliath Spring, a valley named for a legend of a battle between a giant and a hero. The place was strategically perfect. It was a vast open field of rolling hills and dense foliage that could easily conceal an army. Baybars studied the ground, positioning the main Mamluk body, the flanks and the center behind the ridges, completely hidden from the north. The army was to be divided into three parts: the concealed majority, the visible central force led by Sultan Qutuz, and the vanguard of deception led by Baybars himself. Baybars' orders were simple and utterly terrifying. His vanguard, a smaller, highly mobile force, would charge the Mongol army head-on. They would fight briefly, giving the appearance of a probing attack, and then feign a total panicked rout. They would flee directly back through the valley, drawing the main Mongol force deep into the bowl of Ain Jalut. This was the moment of gravest danger. If even one man in Baybars' vanguard hesitated or truly broke, the entire force would be slaughtered, the plan would fail, and the world would fall to the Mongols. This high-stakes bluff was the blueprint for a miracle. When the Mongol army, led by the confident Kit Buka, finally marched south, they saw exactly what they expected: a Mamluk force drawn up in a traditional line, ready to meet them. The Mongols had a history of making their enemies feel trapped, and they relished the idea of finishing off this final defiant state. Kit Buka knew the reputation of Mamluk cavalry, but he trusted his own army's vast experience in devastating feigned retreats and flanking maneuvers. He could not have known that he was walking into a mirror image of his own favorite tactic. On the 3rd of September, 1260, the morning mist lifted over the valley of Ain Jalut. The silence before the clash was heavy with the weight of history. For the Mamluks, this was more than a battle. It was the ultimate jihad for survival, a moment of destiny for the entire world. Baybars' vanguard rode out first. They were disciplined, precise, and utterly ruthless. They engaged the Mongol line, trading a flurry of arrows and quick skirmishes, fulfilling the first part of the plan perfectly. Then came the turn. With a coordinated signal, Baybars and his men executed the feigned retreat. They wheeled around and appeared to run for their lives, their formation deliberately dissolving into a convincing image of desperate flight. Kit Buka saw exactly what he wanted to see: the enemy's front collapsing under pressure. It confirmed his deep-seated prejudice. The Mamluks were just another army of soft city dwellers, all bluster and no backbone. The general grinned, gave the order, and the Mongol army, fueled by 50 years of uninterrupted victory and supreme arrogance, charged in a massive, disorganized wave to hunt the fleeing Mamluks and finish the war. They poured into the valley, chasing the illusion of a broken army, pushing deep into the killing field. The air was filled with the pounding of thousands of hooves and the terrifying, joyful cries of the Mongol pursuers. They were blinded by the scent of victory, chasing the seemingly defeated vanguard, believing the battle was already won. The disciplined Mamluks under Baybars, running just fast enough to lure their enemy, never broke formation. It was a terrifying test of nerve, but the Mamluk system held fast. As the Mongols drove deeper into the valley, they suddenly realized the chase was too good, too easy. Baybars' cavalry was running with a speed that was too controlled, too steady. The pursuit had taken them far from the open plains and funneled them into the tight confines of the valley floor, with the high hills rising up on both sides. It was at this moment that the world tilted. A coordinated blare of trumpets erupted, not from the front, but from the flanks. The signal had been given. From behind the concealed ridges, the main Mamluk force rose like the earth itself was turning against the invaders. The flanks, heavy cavalry masses led by Qutuz, burst from cover on both sides, smashing directly into the disorganized and vulnerable sides of the charging Mongol column. The sudden, overwhelming counterattack caught the Mongols entirely by surprise. They were immediately trapped, pinned between the fresh Mamluk lines and the end of the valley, with their superior speed and maneuverability completely nullified. The battle instantly devolved into a chaotic, close-quarters slugfest, the kind of fighting where Mamluk discipline and superior armor held a massive advantage over the lighter Mongol horse archers. The Mongols were used to picking off enemies from afar, Now they were forced to fight hand to hand against a heavier, better armed, and fanatically motivated enemy. The valley floor turned into a swirling vortex of steel, dust, and blood. The Mongol command structure, caught off guard, struggled desperately to regain control. General Kitbuka, realizing he had been tricked by his own favorite tactic, fought with ferocious personal courage, but the Mamluk pressure was relentless. At the critical moment, the Mamluk left wing began to waver, pushed back by the sheer desperation of the Mongol countercharge. This was the moment the battle could have been lost. Sultan Kutuz, watching from the center, recognized the crisis. In a moment of supreme cinematic leadership, he discarded his helmet and threw it to the ground, a symbolic act of abandoning his own safety. He plunged into the thickest part of the melee, shouting the Muslim war cry, "O Islam! O Islam!" His personal charge, leading his reserves directly into the failing wing, stabilized the line and reignited the Mamluk zeal. The psychological impact of seeing their sultan fighting bareheaded in the middle of the carnage was electrifying. Kutuz rallied his men, and the Mongol counterattack was stopped cold. The tide of battle, which had briefly seemed to hesitate, now turned irrevocably against the invaders. General Kitbuka was captured in the fighting, and without his command, the Mongol army collapsed. They were no longer the scourge of God. They were simply men, overwhelmed, out-generaled, and now, for the first time in 50 years, utterly routed. The Mamluks pursued them aggressively, ensuring that the remnants of the army could not regroup and flee. The victory was total, absolute, and world-shattering. Share this video with someone who needs to hear the true story of Ain Jalut. The sound of the Mongol army in full retreat, a sound that the world had believed was impossible, echoed through the valley. The Mamluk silence that followed was one of stunned disbelief and exultant exhaustion. They had done the unthinkable. They had defeated the Mongols in the open field, shattering the 50-year-old myth of their invincibility forever. The battle, fought in a single day, had changed the entire course of human history. In the aftermath, General Kitbuka was brought before Sultan Kutuz. The Mongol general, still defiant, warned Kutuz of the impending vengeance of Hulagu. Kutuz listened, then ordered Kitbuka's execution. It was a grim necessity, a final, symbolic act to show that the Mamluk state was no longer terrified, and that this defeat was final. The Mamluks drove north, chasing the remnants of the Mongol force out of the entire Levant, reclaiming every city, including Damascus, with little resistance. The world slowly began to grasp the monumental nature of what had occurred at Ain Jalut. The secret weapon was not a physical device, not magic, and not superior numbers. The secret weapon was the Mamluk system itself, the unyielding discipline of their slave-trained cavalry, the strategic brilliance of Baybar's feigned retreat, and the personal resolve of Kutuz to risk everything in a single, perfectly executed maneuver. They used the Mongols' signature tactic, the deceptive retreat, against them, weaponizing the enemy's own arrogance. The consequences of this victory were immediate and vast. Ain Jalut established a permanent frontier against the Mongol Empire. The Mamluks had halted the Mongol push into North Africa, protecting Egypt, the last great independent Islamic power, and securing its future for centuries to come. Had the Mongols taken Egypt, they would have gained a vital land bridge into North Africa and a powerful naval base from which to threaten the Mediterranean. The victory guaranteed that the Mongols would never expand further west. Unknowingly, the Mamluks had also provided a critical shield for Europe. By diverting the focus of the Mongol Ilkhanate eastward and tying up their forces in the Levant, the Mamluks permanently removed the strategic threat of a Mongol flanking maneuver on Europe, allowing the continent to consolidate its own power over the following decades. The legacy of the battle is simple. Ain Jalut was the high water mark of Mongol expansion. The tide went out, and it never came back. It proved that a well-disciplined, highly motivated professional force, led by brilliant command, could overcome impossible odds. It was the moment that faith, discipline, and tactical genius drew a line in the sand and defined the modern map of the Middle East. Let us know in the comments what history story you want next. The Battle of Ain Jalut is a powerful story of how the very people society considered disposable, the Mamluks, the slave kings rose to become the saviors of civilization. It proves that history isn't always made by emperors, but sometimes by the ones who have the most to lose. Like this video and subscribe to the channel for more incredible battles that shaped our world.